asking, I would like to start by asking each of the participants in the conversation to just briefly introduce yourself, perhaps your name, your campus, and then after that, I will introduce someone who will read us a poem. So, Ila, if I may ask you to go first.
Kamusta everyone? My name is Ila De Leon and I'm an English faculty at South Seattle College. I identify as Filipina and Asian American.
Paul.
So good afternoon. Thank you everybody for coming. I'm Paul Kurose. I'm a Sansei, third generation Japanese American, identifies Asian American, he, him pronouns, and I teach at North Seattle College, a math teacher, and welcome.
Deepa.
Hi, everybody. Namaskar. My name is Deepa Bandaru. I identify as South Asian American, and I teach social justice and intersectional studies at North Seattle College.
And Jeff.
Aloha mai kako. My name is Jeffrey. Home for me is Kalihi in Hawaii, and I teach American Ethnic Studies at Seattle Central College. Hello.
And Diana.
Hi, my name is Diana Ma, and I identify as Chinese and Asian American. I teach English and Humanities at North Seattle Community College.
Terry.
Hi, my name is Terry Chung. I teach at North Seattle as an English faculty member, and I identify as what we call 1.5 generation immigrant. My family immigrated when we were teenagers from South Korea.
And I want to just ask if Helen Engera is among the participants, because we welcome you to be in this in the spotlighting that is part of Zoom. So if you are here, Jacob Chin you can let him know. We are so happy to have everyone. And I've just been reminded, I failed to say that my name, no, I think I said my name, Tracy Lai. I teach at Seattle Central, and I am a paper granddaughter, which means that my grandparents were detained at Angel Island. And I would like us to just go forward in our conversation, and I will next ask Diana to share a poem that she's written.
Thank you, Tracy. This poem was published last November in the literary journal Anomaly, and it was published as a part of a special folio called Citizenship and Its Discontents, and it was edited by Grace Lowe Prasad, who is a wonderful author and editor. So this poem is called 6 Feet. Cough into your elbow, shelter your skin to your skin against the words you breathe in. Chinese virus. Yes, I know it hurts. The swollen blaze of marrow, your lungs sliced apart like filleted fish, breath scraping up tender tissue, desperate to stay in your body. Keep exhaling into the inside of your elbow. Your skin there is soft enough, the crease deep enough. The warm steam of your breath will return to your lungs. The 6 feet between you and them has always been there. Keep your mask on, the one with the soft cotton on the inside and a dinosaur print on the outside. Who can be afraid of a child wearing an orange brontosaurus? They will be afraid. They will put forefingers to the corners of their eyes and stretch a slant to their eyelids. They will spit at you, spittle slick with fear. Chant, yellow, yellow, yellow. Stab you, burn you with acid, break your home into spirals of shattered glass. The virus is not the one we think we know. Wash your hands, not because you are dirty. You are not. You are not dog eater, chink, dangerous, diseased. You are not. You are the child who runs so fast your body shakes like a wind whip wave and nothing can catch you. Bring my love nearer than breath, deeper than skin, close as your heart. And even then, my love will not protect you in the ways you or I think it will. We are all guessing at the distance that will keep us safe. And I will go ahead and put the link to that poem in the chat.
Thank you so much, Diana. That is incredibly powerful. You are making me think about racism as a virus. And thanks for letting me share my screen, everyone. The way we wanted to focus our conversation was to respond in part to an essay that appears in Cathy Park Hong's collection, Minor Feelings. And one of the questions we thought we'd start with is, how do you relate to the term Asian American? And the quote it's actually, well, the quote, and I gave you the page number, is not in the essay that we had sort of chosen for ourselves, but we felt like it was a really important reminder about the origins of the term Asian American. And I'm wondering if, Deepa, if you might get us started.
Yeah, Diana, that poem is, yeah, just, it's chilling actually. And I think I love that it's sort of echoing, will create an echo around our conversation today. So yeah, I think this, for me, you know, this term Asian American is one that I have only recently started identifying with. So I actually tweeted to Cathy Park Hong recently, thanking her for this book and for the way it's helped me understand myself as an Indian American, a South Asian American, a brown-skinned Asian, in the context of, you know, Asian American politics. So when I was younger, I was called the N-word a number of times. And I think I gravitated much more to the Black experience and the Black radical experience as one that I could connect to more, in part because I also didn't feel totally included by the term Asian American and by the Asian American community, which seemed to me more specific to East Asians. But I think over time, as you know, I started learning more and studying ethnic American history more, I recognized that, you know, there is a certain political power in Pan-Asian and Pan-Asian American and AAPI, Pacific Islander solidarity as well. And so this is something that I think we're developing and we're building, and we recognize that there's a lot of diversity in terms of the Asian American and Pacific Islander experience. We come from different national backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds. There's colorism among Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. There's colorism within our specific national communities as well. And so I think I'm inspired by this moment and the depth and nuance that I see being fleshed out among people who identify as Asian Americans. And so that makes it easier for me to also feel connected.
Thank you, Deepa. Jeff, what are your thoughts?
Thank you, Deepa and Tracy, for that. I very similarly to Deepa, it's a new term for me. So I grew up in Hawaii. I'm 1.5 generation Filipino. And so even the term, I think I grew up working class in Hawaii. And in Hawaii, if you ask people sort of large part in my community, what's their ethnic background or what are you? Nobody hyphenated. And so it's only when I went to graduate school here on the continent, we call the United States or Turtle Island the continent, because I was sort of, it's only then that I learned to use, but I use it almost in the way that who's it, Spivak have used it as a strategic essentialism, to fight for policy, to fight for resources, but not necessarily an identity that I grew up with or that I used to identify. So I use that for grants, for policy, for movement building, but it's not necessarily a language that I used back home or in my household or even in the circle of my own community. So, sure.
Thanks, Jeff. Carrie, would you like to share some thoughts?
Sure. For me, it was an evolution of sorts to get to kind of embracing the term Asian American. As relatively recent immigrants, our family moved in 1985 to California. And so for a long time, I just called myself a Korean immigrant. And then it took me a while to get to the Korean American immigrant part. And it wasn't until I went to college, and mostly I'm an English teacher, so mostly through literature, kind of embracing this whole body of literature called Asian American literature, but not seeing myself in it, because recognizing the kind of the diversity of the diaspora that is the Asian American experience. And a lot of the Asian American writers writing at the time were generations deep. And here I was in a fairly 5-6 years into the country, but still looking for that and longing for that recognition, the look of recognition, as Kathy Park Hong talks about in her book. Yeah, so, but it was something of a coming into being and recognizing the political power behind it. Yeah, so it was a powerful kind of evolution of sorts.
Thank you, Terry. Ela.
Thank you, Deepa, Jeff, and Terry. I totally, what you've shared totally resonate with me. I used to, well, first of all, if my family were here and they hear me say that I identify as Asian American, they're like, what the, like, you're Pinay, you're Filipina, because I am also 1.5 gen. And we, meaning my family, this term Asian American, it feels like it doesn't belong to us. And I'm also beginning to just acknowledge it, embrace it as I learn more about like the history of the term Asian American. I just learned it from the book, and it's so I'm still kind of getting used to it, and it's a newish term for me. Thanks.
Thank you, Ela. Diana, any thoughts?
Yeah, my thoughts about it are a little bit different in that for me, Asian American seems as true as anything else, as Chinese, because the term Chinese for me is very complicated. This is how my family identifies, and this is how I've always grown up, knowing I'm Chinese, I'm Chinese, I'm Chinese. But when I think about it, my parents spent most of their childhood actually in Taiwan. Mm-hmm. So because of a history of diaspora and colonization, that was just what had happened. So I actually never went to China until I was an adult. And also when people think Chinese, they're thinking Han, the majority ethnicity, which my family is not. Mm-hmm. We are Hui, which is an ethnic minority that is Muslim. And in fact, my father has done some research, and our ancestors came from somewhere in the Ottoman Empire, modern day Turkey. So the term Chinese is problematic already. Mm-hmm. So Asian American in many ways seems like a more honest reflection of my identity. Although Chinese American is also true, but just not the full story.
Thanks, Diana. And Paul.
So unlike most other people here, I was actually around and when this term came about. I was 12 years old back in '68. And so when we started identifying ourselves as Asian American, that was a really strong statement. It was, we are saying who we are. We're not saying who we are from this Eurocentric perspective. The Orient is over there. We're not over there. We're right here, and we're Asian American, and we're proud of that. And so I came into that term with stating that identity as a statement of power. It was at the same time that African Americans at that time were saying, no, we're not Negro, we're Black. African American men were saying, we're not boys, we're men. And actually, as a young kid, we were saying, no, we're not boys, we're men. And so that was all part of us saying, we're defining who we are, and we're not accepting your definition of who we are.
Thanks, Paul. I'm going to try to move us to the next question, and I'm sure we'll be circling back to include more of our ideas. So this next question, how have you experienced minor feelings? Because this is a phrase that appears repeatedly in the anthology. And so we don't have to go in exactly the same order that we did before. Terry, can I ask you if you'd like to start us on minor feelings?
Oh boy, this is a tough one for me. I mean, it's not because of dearth of experience so much as just how to articulate my thoughts on it coherently. I think that I'll just start local, you know, in our college system. I think there's just, you know, I was just talking about this with some students the other day, just talking about how, particularly a woman of color, and I think Asian women sometimes, it's unexpected. Our rage is unexpected, I think, which is why I just admire Senator Hirano so much because of her raw rage and her ability to speak it. So, you know, I think that as I get older, you know, I think when I arrived in the Seattle colleges system, really young in experience, in a very aging and white department. So I was kind of a token, you know, minority. And, you know, I felt that burden to a certain extent, but also just kind of that, you know, I told a colleague that I was a jazz musician, and he was really surprised. In a well-intentioned kind of way. I mean, he thought I was like, oh, classical pianist or something, you know, so, you know, in that kind of, but that was just a relentless series of those kinds of, you know, microaggressions, the othering that was just ever present. But as I got older, kind of, you know, as a culturally conditioned as an Asian woman to kind of suppress and not speak up and not voice your anger. And I'm like, you know, at this point, I'm like, fuck it. Like, who am I trying to please? And who cares, like, what people think of me? So I'm more comfortable giving voice to that anger and actually utilizing that anger for activism, not just for my community and for others. So that's kind of the space I am in, and kind of thinking about how to do that more effectively.
Oh, thank you, Terry. Well, let's see, Jeff.
You know, can I pass on this one, Tracy? I think
That's fine.
I sort of need time to think about it.
Okay, that's okay. Diana?
Great, get to follow Terry. So I have a lot of feelings about this. As I sometimes say to my children, big feelings when I can't articulate exactly what they are. I was recently struck by I was on a panel recently It was a panel of AAPI authors writing young adult romance. And so we had all written young adult romance novels. And a question from the audience was, what is it like to write romance under the white male gaze?
Mm.
And every single one of us, without hesitation, had a story to tell about how our bodies, our sexualities were exotified and fetishized. And the shared rage in that, virtual room, because this was on Zoom, of course, was very healing in some ways, that we were acknowledging this rage. And Kathy Park Hong talks about how that rage from Asian women writers and artists is unpalatable to a white audience. That when we write, we're supposed to not express our minor feelings, but instead write in a way that takes care of white feelings. And so in writing characters that have feelings, that confront racism, that have a racialized identity, becomes then a radical act. And it wasn't until I read this chapter, and I read the book for the first time a while ago, and I reread it, that I realized how hard it was to write in this environment. And when I read, because I do that horrible thing where I read my Goodread reviews, but when I read them, I'm struck by how many people say things like, I just couldn't relate to this character. It seems like she has no identity outside of being Asian. Or this was not the book I expected. I was expecting Crazy Rich Asians, and I got stuff about racism about Hollywood. And then one review by a white person actually said that my book was hate speech because it was critical of one of the white characters for his racism. And it's just that, so I guess the question is, how have you experienced minor feelings? Just being an artist, a writer, an Asian American female artist in this climate of always being expected to write something that is palatable for the white gaze is creates that rage in me.
Thanks, Diana. Paul.
So I have these feelings every once in a while. So I want to share a little piece of the text that I looked at, because being a math teacher, I looked at what's on this screen share, and I had to pull out a dictionary and kind of figure it out. And then I saw this one line in the text that helped me really get it. And it said, minor feelings occur when you're told things like, things are so much better, while you think things are the same. And that really made it make good sense to me. And and that's what I'm saying. Yeah, I've kind of felt this way every once in a while, because so often there's this acceptance of things the way they are. And we're told, oh, they're so much better. And it's like, so we're supposed to feel better about things still being blatantly racist, and because things are so much better now. And so the other thing that really struck me was, it said, when minor feelings are finally externalized, they're interpreted as hostile. And it says, when we finally decide to share them, when we decide to be honest, that's how we're seen. And recently I was accused of being uncivil in my discourse around racism in our district. And I said, well, I think, I consider racism to be pretty uncivil myself. So if you consider my expressing my feelings about that, well, so be it. But so often we're considered, they didn't use that term uncivil here in the text. They mentioned hostile, ungrateful, jealous, belligerent. And so the term that I had thrown at me was being uncivil. So yeah, so this is something I really related to in the text. So I really appreciated this.
Thank you, Paul. Ela, is there something you'd like to share here?
This is a tough one for me to respond to. And I think I will continue to reflect on it, but I do feel that for some reason, I'm not allowed to show my anger. Like, it's some, in my family, that's okay. Like I'm not allowed to be sad, but I feel like in spaces like this, there's that maybe internalized oppression that I'm still processing, that I can't show like my range of emotions. And I feel like I'm not angry enough, or I'm afraid to show my anger. But I do remember a quote from Audre Lorde about like using my anger to as like fuel to make the changes that I want to see. So I also grew up in the Philippines, so I have lived in a world where I wasn't a second-class citizen, and I saw, like, I grew up in, like, there's abject poverty around me, and I grew up middle class, and so there's like, guilt, of like living better than the people around me. And there's like people like Dr. Hunt and Deepa talked about colorism. I'm in the Philippines. I'm, have color privilege. I'm Filipino Chinese. My dad's a professional. So all these things. So there's that guilt. And I know if that's part of minor feelings of, living kind of like an okay life compared to a lot of the Filipino maids all over the world, working their asses off to send money to their families. So, and like reading histories of, and what's happening to our Black cousins, Black brothers and sisters, that, so I'm still processing a lot of these things. Like, I'm super angry about those things, but maybe I don't know, I still don't know much about my own history, Asian American history. So thanks.
Thank you, Ela. Deepa.
Well, when I think about this idea of minor feelings, I'm also thinking about the whole model minority myth and the idea that Asian Americans are, like our ancestors, our communities were brought here, invited here, as my dad says. My dad uses this word, we were invited, right? And we were invited here to fill a very specific role and a specific economic role. And we should be grateful for this, right? And I think, like, for me, these minor feelings first erupted in my home because I was born here. I was born in Chicago. I'm an American, and I was angry that I wasn't seen as an American. I was angry that from a very young age, that I was very aware of my second-class citizen status. And I think this is what drew me towards like what are seen as angry voices, like reading Malcolm X in high school, right? And feeling like, I have an outlet for this rage, and this rage is linked to this larger system of white supremacy and capitalism. And learning about how Asian Americans fit into that system, right? And having that exposed, I think has allowed me to turn these minor feelings into major feelings, right? And to link up with other communities that have been oppressed, and to think about, like, that nobody should be treated as a second class citizen. It is completely unacceptable. You should not feel grateful. Like, the idea that you are always comparing what your life was like, quote unquote, back home, right? Like, you can't just accept things on the terms that exist right here, right? I think that's unacceptable. And I love the anger. I love seeing this anger, like, just coming out, and people saying, like, no, this is not okay.
Well, thank you, Deepa, for anticipating the next several questions. And since we're also kind of have maybe not quite 20 minutes left, let's start with this one. But the following question actually goes into model minority myth, and so my participants, you feel as you feel moved, you can kind of integrate some of those thoughts. So in this question, how have you found your own voice in the context of white supremacy? And if you wanted to share who has inspired you to find your voice, I'm thinking about what Deepa just said about, reading Malcolm X, and I think maybe some of the others have also talked about other very important thinkers, activists, and I think I'll start by asking Jeff if you'd like to start us off here, or if you feel like the model minority question, which, let's see, can I cleverly show that? Yeah. How does the model minority myth inform Asian American and Pacific Islander identities? Feel free to address either of those. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Tracy. I really like this question, actually. And again, I think context matters of where you are and where you're born. Like Ila, I was born in the Philippines. And so I grew up not having to ask myself, what does it mean to be Filipino? But I grew up, in the Makati, Fort Bonifacio area, in the squatters, in the tenements. I don't know what's the English equivalent of squatters in here in the United States, but it's makeshift areas. And so I was that, right? And then my mother moved to Hawaii and brought everybody up, maybe ghettos, but I feel like it's worse, in some ways. So she moved, and I grew up rural, working class, and I felt love. I mean, I think that's the thing. Like, I was never made to feel like my identity was in the backdrop of whiteness. And so moving to Hawaii, growing up working class in a largely Hawaiian, Samoan, Filipino, I never saw in my life white folks, until maybe in the university. And that's when I've started to engage sort of whiteness. But even then, I have to say, and I'm glad sort of Paul invited that term and that history of Asian American, because I've had mentors who protected me and insulated me and absorbed the racialized oppression that I was supposed to feel. So I feel really grateful. And what does that mean? It means that all throughout my life, I felt like it was privileged, but it's not. It's the oppression that was absorbed either by my family, my extended community, and that racialized gaze and that action that's supposed to hit me had buffers before it hit me. And so I want to acknowledge that, because that's a lot. My community protected me. It's sort of like when you hear stories of family members who's part of a gang, and that their other brother, sister, or something wasn't allowed to, and yet it existed. It was like that. It's like I had a gang that was protecting me all throughout my life, and a lot of them were Black and brown women who helped me get up all the way to the doctoral program. And so I grew up with that kind of love, that radical love that maybe Andrew Lord speaks about, in terms of that radiates so much, it protects you, that allows you. And so I've only taught in classes where 99% are people of color. And so the idea of we, I used even in my classroom. Can you imagine? I mean, how liberating that space where you only can use we. I've dined and been appointed to political positions that, again, that insulated me, that allowed me to express that rage almost free of harm. I'm no big shot or anything, but I recognize that um, um, I get to pass that down from to my daughter, and my daughter, and that kind of, you don't have to feel insecure in that sense, at least within our own household. That language gets inculcated in my own family. And so folks like, I have to name them, the Amy Agbayanis, the Haunani K. Trasks, all of those who built Hawaii for what it is, and that refuse for them to see and call out mainland. We don't use mainland. I grew up using the continent. Folks there, Turtle Island, we never acknowledged whiteness as a center, even though my life is in the backdrop of whiteness and academia and political, all of that stuff. I just, was protected by that. So there's a lot more to say, but I'm sure a lot more folks. So mahalo for that.
Thank you, Jeff. Diana, I'm wondering if you'd like to go next.
Sure. All of these questions, I feel like I have so much to say. And absolutely, I identified so much with this quote. I feel like I've read it over and over and over again to just take it in. And it's true. And that plays into the model minority. As Asian Americans, Asian American women in particular, we are raised and educated to stay quiet, work hard, keep our head down, not be angry, not be leaders, not raise a ruckus, not make a change. And that is hard to break out of. And it is an effort. I was going to say every day, but I feel like every minute, to remind myself, I don't need to be polite. I don't need to pacify anyone. But the truth is, there are consequences when I don't. And I recognize that too. So it's that constant burden of realizing this is the way I am expected to be. Yet, if I fulfill that role, Zola put in a wonderful quote by Zola Neale Hurston. And I'm not accessing it right now, but just then you die. But if you do speak up, you can get hurt too. So there's it's in many ways a no-win situation. So when she says at the end, I didn't know how to escape it, I completely understand that feeling. But you have a more positive question. How have you found your own voice? And I think there are so many things that I can't do on my own behalf that I've had to do when I became a parent for my children. And what I didn't say when I introduced that poem is that I haven't written a poem in over a decade. And I certainly haven't submitted a poem in much longer than that. And but it wasn't until I read Kathy Park Hong's book, she is a poet, And her talk of the way that poetry is taught, and I went through poetry workshops and all that, is that as a poet, you're supposed to have what Keats explains as negative capability, which means your identity. She didn't use that term in the book, but it's one I've taught in poetry classes, where the poet is removed. So the poem itself is for the reader to inhabit. But what she said, which I never realized before, is what that means is that her identity as Asian American is also erased in order to make room for the poem, which is supposed to have negative capability. And it didn't occur to me that maybe that's a reason that I haven't written poetry in a decade, that I had to erase myself and my identity as Asian in order to write poetry, or what was considered poetry. And then I read Claudia Rankine's amazing book, Citizen. And her rage was out there, and her minor feelings were out there. And it spoke to me in a way that poetry had never spoken to me before. And I think, and the fact that it was the submission call was for a folio called Citizenship and Its Discontents. And it was examining ways in which people of color did not belong in the United States. It was examining citizenship. So that felt like that was a place for my poem. And that's when I was able to write poetry again. So I think that's one of the ways I found my voice in the context of white supremacy.
Wow, thank you, Diana. Paul?
Wow, I'm still just so moved by what Jeffrey said in, starting off our responses to this question. And my young sibling is, just appreciate the words you shared. And, I kind of feel the same way that our elders have brought us here. They carried us to this point, and that's why we do what we do. They inspired us, they modeled the behavior for us, and they brought us forward. And for me personally, I was very privileged. I grew up in the Central District in Seattle. In that time, like I said, I was 12 years old when this term Asian American came about, and we were shouting, "We're Asian." I grew up in a family that I was raised in a family that was using its voice to challenge the white supremacy that we were that we were living under. I grew up in a community. We were part of a community that was doing that in Seattle Central District. So the quote there from the textbook, from not textbook, but from the book, was kind of different. It was different from my experience. Certainly there were elements of that I was in the public school system. I had the teachers that were in that school system. But even in that, 4 out of my 6 elementary school teachers were African American. And so in the Central District, I had a different upbringing than what we see many in our society experiencing today. And part of that was because of the segregation, because of some of the things that my mom got involved in protesting against. As I was saying, I had the privilege of being raised by someone who was modeling using their voice against white supremacy. My mom was involved in protests of the housing discrimination that people of color in Seattle were victims of. Actually, this house, very house I'm sitting in right now, my parents weren't allowed to buy this house from the realtor because it was on this side of the red line. And so having grown up, being part of a family, part of a community that was using their voices, I don't even feel like I was inspired. That's what I was kind of just raised to be, to do that, to be that way. And so, you know, it was a privilege, but again, with that privilege, you know, certainly came some of those responses that, you know, I mentioned before, how people look at us when we use our voices. And in relation to that model minority myth that, you know, and it's changed so much. That term came up back in those 60s, back in the 50s and 70s. But even in terms of that, people often say, you know, they look at me, or they even sometimes comment like, oh, we're shocked that you talk like this, right? And so anyway, so I was inspired, and I was fortunate to have grown up in a family and community that inspired me to use my voice.
Thank you, Paul. Deepa and Ela, I am not forgetting you. I am a little bit conscious of the time. We're really running close to the hour. So if I can sort of invite you to, if you still want to talk about these questions, that's great. But we had 2 last questions. We will not get through all of this, but if you did wish to sort of move that forward, that would be fine. What are your thoughts on the structural oppression that pits groups against each other? And then hoping to touch on how can we collectively respond to the rise in anti-Asian hate? Deepa, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I know we're really running out of time, but I would just encourage, I mean, one thing that this group of amazing faculty and staff is, we're putting together an event next Thursday, an activist panel, where we're inviting young AAPI activists and veteran AAPI activists to come and talk over Zoom with our campus communities about building intersectional solidarity and resisting hate and resisting white supremacy and other forms of exploitation and oppression. So I would really encourage folks to show up to that next Thursday. That's my plug. And I just put something in the chat just about the role of educators. I think, like, as you know, a community of educators, both Jeff and Paul talked about the importance of being in a community of exploration that was safe and that was predominantly people of color, and what that means and how that really helps to cultivate your voice and your independence and protect you to really develop. I think that that's another important thing.
Thank you, Deepa. And Terry, it's any of the questions, or maybe it's just closing thoughts.
Boy, that's a lot of pressure. So I think Deepa's plug for the intersectional solidarity is important, because what Kathy Park Kong's book illustrates is what happens when communities of colors are pitted against each other, when, you know, because of the model minority myth and Asians, the Korean immigrants in LA, I have a lot of deep roots in LA, Koreatown, and lots of friends whose families lost their stores, their convenience stores, their grocery stores, their dry cleaners during the LA riots. And, you know, at the time, I didn't like what she describes. I didn't know how to feel, like who to feel solidarity with, you know, with both the rioters who were angry about the Rodney King verdict, yet feeling for my community who were hurting and who lost all of their livelihoods, but knowing that it was and there is anti-Blackness in the Asian American community that fueled that anger, but there was also the model minority myth that fueled that anger, that made to believe that in the media, it became a Korean versus Blacks, rather than it's the white supremacy, stupid, right? You know, what are the structural oppression and the poverty and the redlining that led to these issues that perpetuated this problem, rather than, so I think it is important to keep an eye on, like, how do we move forward 27, 8, almost 30 years later, and building that solidarity. So I think Deepa's plug for the activist panel is an excellent one.
Thank you. And Ela.
Thank you. I would like to respond to the question, who has inspired you to find your voice? I feel like I'm still finding my voice, and I'm super grateful and humbled and honored to be with the amazing Asian American leaders in this room. Betsy Hasegawa, Dr. Hunt, and then Asian American, Dr. Hunt, well, your cousin, Tracy.
I'm a first cousin.
But I do, you inspire me, like, and there's so many folks who inspire me, like, just the people in this room, like Deepa and your leadership, and yeah, so just grateful to you all.
Thanks, Ela. We have, I think we knew that an hour would go very quickly, and maybe we can all think of this as a to be continued in another space at another time. But I do want to ask, before we formally close, if anyone in our fishbowl has some other thoughts they'd like to close with.
I just want to thank everyone in the fishbowl. It has been such a healing experience to talk so frankly and openly with all of you, and to hear your stories and your insights. And I also want to thank everyone out there who has been so supportive in listening and holding our stories. So thank you so much.
And I would also like to thank Tracy Lai, who has been an amazing leader for AAPI faculty and staff on campus, has really spearheaded this whole month of event planning and bringing people together. She's such just an amazing community builder. Not just on campus, but off campus. And so Tracy, thank you so much for facilitating and just leading this month's events.
Beloved community, before we leave, let's give Tracy the roses while all of us live. She can't hear when she died. So if anybody can put one word to leave with beloved Tracy, please. Lightning chat. I learned that from Dennis Dimon and the Young Peoples. So I just put in here, inimitable.
I just jump in real quick to say that as we do all of these events, Black History Month, Asian American Pacific Island History Month, we can't just allow our institutions to have that be the moment where our issues get some attention and then we go up back to business as usual. So I think using our voice throughout the year, others also supporting us, being part of the conversation, and not just part of the conversation, but look to lead our district in addressing issues of race and equity. Year round, not just this month.
Exactly. Well, thank you. I know we've taken extra of your time, but we're feeling it, and we do expect to continue this conversation. So next week, Thursday, same time, 12 o'clock. an intergenerational activist panel. So meeting people from the community and especially the young folks who have recently organized the Stop AAPI Hate demonstrations and in support of justice for John Quinn, the young man who was killed in Bothell. So we will see you next time and keep organizing, everybody. Silent no more.
Thank you, Tracy.
Tracy. Thanks, everyone.
Or like one of our panelists said, fuck no, no more silence.